Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP 103.3 in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting out of occupied Salagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world. This week, Scott spoke with Mohamed Abdu, a North African Egyptian Muslim anarchist activist scholar who's currently a visiting scholar at Cornell University and an assistant professor of sociology at the American University in Cairo. Mohamed is the author of the recent book Islam and Anarchism, Relationships and Resonances, published by Pluto Press in 2022. For nearly 2 hours, Scott and Mohamed speak about Mohamed's experience of the Tahrir Square uprising of 2011 and the Western media coverage of it, current unrest in Iran, Orientalism, decolonial education, Islam, settler colonialism, anarchism, and a lot more. You can find more of Mohamed's work at mabdou.net or on Twitter or Facebook by searching his name. On Twitter, you can find him at Minuet in G minor, and you'll find a transcript soon of this interview on our website. Stay tuned next week for a chat with organizers of the 2022 Atlanta Radical Bookfair and another surprise topic. For Patreon supporters, pretty soon we'll be sharing early releases of conversations with Robert Graham about his 2015 book, We Don't Fear Anarchy, We Invoke It, on the split in the First International and the beginnings of the anarchist movement. And with Matthew Lyons, author of Insurgent Supremacists, about far-right Christian movements and other topics. More on how to support us at tfsr.wtf/support or about our Patreon at patreon.com/tfsr. And now, a few announcements. For listeners in the Asheville area, you're invited to an outdoor movie night benefit for Asheville Survival Program, Halloweeny season double feature on Saturday, October 8th at 6 p.m. at the Static Age River Spot. There will be food, music, and merch. To find out more about the venue, you can contact Asheville Survival via their email or social media, which can be found at linktr.ee/AVL Survival. If you're in the southeast of Turtle Island, consider visiting so-called Atlanta on Saturday, October 15th, where from noon to 6 p.m. you'll find the Atlanta Radical Bookfair at the Auburn Avenue Research Library on African American culture and history in Georgia. There will be speakers and many tables, including us. If you want to offer support to folks in Florida around Hurricane Ian, one place to start would be with Central Florida Mutual Aid. They have tons of ways to plug in remotely or on the ground for what is likely to be a long and arduous cleanup and repair effort. You can learn more about them at linktr.ee/CFL Mutual Aid. We've regrettably missed the opportunity to promote the Phone Zap campaigns to raise awareness of prisoners in the path of Hurricane Ian before the storm hit, but suggest that folks check out fighttoxicprisons.wordpress.com to learn more about efforts to press public officials to heed calls to protect prisoners during storms like this, rather than follow the path of inertia and cheapness that leads to unnecessary deaths of folks behind bars. Finally, there is currently a prison strike within the Alabama Department of Corrections, known by the hashtag #ShutdownADOC2022. Campaigners have organized a calling campaign to demand an end to retaliation against Kinetic Justice, whose state name is Robert Earl Council, who has been assaulted by guards on September 29th and placed in solitary confinement, as well as trying to stop the retaliation against any other prisoners participating in the strike. The demands also include an end to retaliation against any prisoners participating in the strike, Kinetic's release from solitary, and the meeting of prisoners' demands. Supporters are asked to call Warden William Streeter at 256-233-4660 or Commissioner John Hamm at 334-353-3883. You can find a recent interview with Kinetic at Unicorn Riot about the assault, as well as more on the prison strike at unicornriot.ninja.
So I'm very excited to be talking with Mohamed Abdu, the author of the recent Pluto Press book, Islam and Anarchism, Relationships and Resonances, which I think is an incredibly important contribution. And Mohamed, would you introduce yourself with your pronouns and any affiliations or connections that you would like to name?
Assalamu alaikum, Scott. Thank you very much for having me. Can speak to you today, and assalamu alaikum to our audience. Insofar as my pronouns, he, they, them, him. Insofar as a little bit of background with regards to myself, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Cornell University and a visiting scholar, and an assistant professor of sociology at the American University of Cairo. Self-identifying Muslim anarchist and settler of color of North African and Arab descent. I'm a scholar activist. I've been involved in movements post-Seattle 1999, the anti-globalization movements, as well as Tahrir with the Zapatistas, indigenous struggles like the Mohawks of Tanzania during the struggle over the Culverstone track. And yeah, a lot of movements working towards Palestinian liberation, BIPOC liberation, certainly anti-statist liberation, and anti-capitalist certainly, but definitely anti-statist.
Great, thank you. And yeah, so I'm so glad to talk with you. And going off of that experience, I thought maybe we could sort of frame our discussion, since reading the book, especially towards the end of the book, it seems like a lot of the reflections were spurred on from your experience, during the so-called Arab Spring and in Tahrir Square. And then, currently we're in this moment with uprising in Iran. And I was wondering if you could describe some of the lessons you drew from the momentum that was going on at first, and then how it ultimately failed, and maybe like what lessons still haven't been learned, and how we sort of see the media repeating some of the same narratives.
Thank you. That's a very important question, simply because of the reproduction of errors, mistakes, Orientalism, and given the topic of the book. After all, I wrote the book with the sense that language is neither in a certain sense informational nor communicational, as I said, in a talk recently. And I'm very Deleuzian in the sense that the point of language is something else. It's order words. And I don't mean that in an authoritarian sense, but in an action-based sense, either from one statement to another. Tahrir is, you can imagine, perhaps the last chapter was quite triggering. It remains very much triggering, simply because there's a difference between the way that revolutions happen historically in people's revolutionary becomings. What happens to people when they rise up emotionally, physically, mentally? How do they reconceive intimacy? Who's going to pick up the garbage? What are you going to do with a nuclear power plant? What are you going to do with the army when somebody gets sick? So they involve real practical questions. And that I learned offhand very early on from the experience with the Zapatistas. There are three things that are necessary for a revolution to really be called a revolution, or for a revolutionary movement to refer to itself as a revolutionary movement. Number one, you need to have decolonized education, knowledge production, whatever the medium that manifests within. It could be books, it could be literature, it could be talks, oral histories, and so on and so forth, arts, zines, and so on and so forth. A plethora of different forms of knowledge production, because you're replacing the elements of modern coloniality with a completely different paradigm of reference in a revolutionary sense, in such a way that people transform in and of themselves. The Quran, and Muslims know this quite well, has the verse, and they repeat this verse at every almost Friday prayers. God does not change a people until they change in and of themselves. So it is a matter of the greater jihad, the jihad and the struggle against one's own inner microfascisms, my patriarchy that I have to contend with every single day of my life. I have to learn to listen to women, not just hearing them as in preparing a response, a reactionary response to what that has just been said, given the asymmetries of power that exists between me and somebody else. And that's change, transformation of oneself, more so than quote unquote institutions or the removal of a despot. Mubarak was not an autocrat. That is to suggest that Mubarak had complete and utter control and full power. Mubarak depicted himself as God, a pharaoh. Indeed, he was. But that does not mean that, and this is the nuance that comes about with words in the Orwellian world that we live in right now, in which liberalism both stole the words and their meanings. There is no such thing as an autocrat, because we always have agents. Egyptians participated in the facade within Tahrir, before Tahrir, and following Tahrir. Sexual harassment, anti-blackness, nepotism, rashwa, all kinds of factors, of dimensions. There was no alternative project. The so-called masses have. We have to understand that these masses were wide, they were diverse. You had the hijabi, you had the chain-smoking niqabi woman, you had the liberal woman, you had anarchists, certainly, the Marxist-Leninist, revolutionary socialists, referred to as the Ishtraqiyin, Ithawriyin. You had, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood, you have other forms of Islamists insofar as Salafis, and so on and so forth. You had the Nasrites, you had the Sadatists, of course, you had the liberals, and so on and so forth. There were no discussions amongst these different factions with regards to what tomorrow was going to bring, insofar as how we were going to bring about a pluriverse world, or if we were remotely interested in that. There were no discussions of the ethics of disagreement, insofar as what bound the millions of folks that were in Tahrir together, let alone what distinguished them insofar as part. People were merely engaged, and this is part of, unfortunately, the inferiority complex, the psychoaffective phenomenon violence that we internalized in reactionary ways. Now, granted, we're in the heat of the battle, and when you're fighting police forces, the army, we burnt 99 police stations, so much for a nonviolent revolution. And of course, we had sent a letter, comrades of Cairo actually had written a letter to Occupy Wall Street insofar as the facade of nonviolence, because it's quite desecrating and insulting that over 1,000 people die, are martyrs, that we have yet to honor because we have yet to fulfill their dreams or see through their dreams, and assume that this was a nonviolent revolution. Of course, it was not a Twitter revolution as, it's orientally depicted within Euro-American media and so on, conservative, liberal, and so on and so forth either. We had to go knock door to door because the internet was cut out. We had to establish our own community councils. Women were, quote unquote, manning checkpoints. So we see a breakdown of gender relations. Queer folks engaged in a Pride March, and so on and so forth. So the potential was there insofar as social transformation and change. For the first time in Egypt's history, youth were bringing cleaning materials from their households and literally getting on their hands or knees and scrubbing Tahrir. There was a sense of ownership of space, or a sense of belonging to space. It ruptured space and time, galvanized the world. But unfortunately, there were a lot of projections that fed into the middle to upper class English-speaking so-called revolutionaries that really, most of which had no experience insofar as grassroots organizing or the intellectual base from which to think through what are we going to do tomorrow. Egypt is complicit in the occupation of Gaza, the largest concentration camp in the world by air, land, and sea. All these geopolitical factors, these local factors, these regional factors, the assumption that we would just be allowed to do whatever it is that we wanted to do was obviously an illusion. And in so many ways, I lost my voice speaking in Tahrir, that shi'arat, that the slogans, as is occurring in Iran, of freedom, of Aish, Hurriya, Adal Ijtimaiya, Aish, bread, Hurriya, freedom, social justice, Adal Ijtimaiya. What kind of social justice are we talking about here? How do you bring it about? What kind of freedom? What kind of bread? Because you ask two people and you won't get the same response. So what exactly are we talking about here? Where is the strategic revolutionary plan? Now, we can't plan uprisings as much as we can prepare for them. The Zapatistas have a saying, holding each other's hands, we teach one another what each of us knows. But arrogance plays too much of a role, again, for the reason that people are not willing to combat their microfascisms. People are caught within their so-called ideological silos, although I don't believe that ideologies exist. So as I noted, the first thing that was missing is decolonized knowledge education. Number two, the construction of alternatives, alternative egalitarian schools, hospitals, and talking free breakfast programs to Panthers, and so on and so forth. And the third is being prepared to self-defend those initiatives. Now, it's not that initiatives did not arise out of Tahrir, of course. Meda Masr is a great initiative. I interviewed members of initiatives insofar as queer feminists, knowledge production sites, and so on and so forth, social centers. But the permanency was not long-lasting given the durée. We're talking now over 10 years. And the chipping away gradually, let alone the reconstruction and reassertion of space vis-a-vis the state and its collusion with, obviously, neoliberal capital. And what ties both together is the racial dimension, because as we know, or as Foucault had noted, that all states are racist. And as Cedric Robinson and a lot of Black feminists and scholars have taught, including Ruthie Gilmore Wilson, Mariam Kaba, and so on, that capitalism is racist. It is inherently racial. So that is the dilemma of, in a certain sense, of Tahrir. The construction of Egyptian identity, nationality, patriotism, nationalism is what united Egyptian people within itself. And there was nothing beyond that. Down with the regicide, Mubarak. Where is the regicide that exists inside each and every single one of us? That becomes the question. So when we look at Iran now and the manifestation of what is going on in Iran, let us also decipher and discern the geopolitical moment in which we are living. 2 weeks prior, or about even a week to 10 days prior to these events, we had Ayatollah Khamenei, ostensibly a lot of rumors, particularly within your American media, claiming that he's quite ill, he's on his deathbed. Now the man is quite old, and there's no doubt that, of course, he's aging, and so on and so forth, and maybe struck with illness. But he appeared the following day within Iranian national media, and basically to reassert the fact that, no, he's quite fine. God knows best when his time will come, but whatever they may be, today, tomorrow, the day after, that still leaves us with the dilemmas that I noted, and I will continue to be speaking about. We're also in the moment in which the so-called Iranian nuclear deal is being renegotiated. A great deal of asymmetric warfare is already taking place within the region. We have, in a certain sense, a U.S., Wahhabi, Zionist, Euro-American alliance on the one hand, and a so-called axis of resistance composed of so-called anti-imperialists like China, like Russia, Syria, of course, Hezbollah, Hamas, and so on and so forth, although I'll leave just Hezbollah and Hamas for a moment simply because I consider these to be more movements than they are state-oriented, per se. Parties, although of course Hezbollah has Amal. And again, I don't mean to simplify the equation, but these are the false binaries that exist. And this is a geopolitical framing within Islamophobia that is ongoing, within anti-Jewish hate that is ongoing, and an asymmetric warfare. Now comes Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, Mahsa Amini, and what happened with her. A young girl forced to refix by the so-called morality police her hijab, beaten. Accounts differ. And this is the way that we need to think, because there's propaganda going on both sides. Fair enough. People then go out, they revolt, and by the way, on the same day, a 15-year-old Iraqi called Zainab Khazali was murdered and was sniped by a US soldier in Iraq. So look at what gets airtime here. Okay. And a wave of uprisings, if you will, begins to take place. Now, mind you, there are also millions of people that are supporting the Iranian regime. And they're out in the streets, and they're equally protesting. Mind you that we had 20 million people that went out for the funeral of Qasem Soleimani. The question becomes now, insofar as Iran, and Iran is a complicated situation because Wilayat al-Faqih, or the Iranian state, was not meant to be a state within itself. It's meant to have expansionary desires, impetus, particularly in relationship to a concept I talk about in the book, where sovereignty lies, which is the Ummah, a non-territorial concept, a non-status concept, and so on and so forth. Fair enough. In that particular case, we're seeing patriarchal state repression being pitted against the opposite, quote-unquote, dialectical operative, your American heteropatriarchy, homonationalism, pinkwashing, Islamophobia, on the other side. These are the dynamics that we're seeing. We're seeing this embrace them by some, like actresses, I believe her name was Masih Ali Injadas. I think so. That's how, forgive me for mispronouncing her last name, perhaps. She's an Iranian actress. She left Iran quite a few years ago. Of course, repression, persecution, and so on and so forth. But she's quite been outspoken with regards to the hijab. There are many other Muslim women that have been outspoken with regards to the hijab. As far as I'm concerned, all women, let alone Muslim women, could dress whatever way that they want. That is not the point. The hijab is not the symbol of this or that. It is not the symbol of righteousness or purity or whatever it is. It is and has been taken up as a certain symbol of resistance, certainly in Algeria. When we look at Bill C-51 and 52 bills in the context of Quebec, where women are being banned from the hijab, the same thing in France, and so on and so forth, under the guise of laïcité, which is nothing but a secularized Christian ethic, if you will, that these societies are based on. In this particular instance, nonetheless, we see this Iranian actress who has spoken very openly in her support of Zionists, who has very much praised Mike Pompeo and many, many other secretaries of state and secretaries of war in the US. Put out statements. The New York Times writes this article claiming that she is the point person, the leader of this Iranian uprising. This is the degree of confluence of a mess, of a schizophrenic mess in which we live. Now, let me ask to my kin who are on the streets in Iran, as I did of my kin who are on the streets in Egypt, let alone the Black Spring uprisings, as Robin J. Kelly refers to them, insofar as Black Lives Matter. What are the alternatives here? Because I'm not opposed to direct action. Hell, I participated in a lot of direct actions over the course of my life and on the front lines. In the context of Egypt, where I've had friends that died, friends that have been sniped, because in Egypt, when they, or at least in the global south, when they point their guns at you, they're not using simulated weapons. They're not using blanks. They're using live ammunition. And they shoot for your eyes to blind you, to cripple you, to debilitate you, to disable you. Okay. Besides a direct action, which, again, street protests serve as a cathartic moment of revolt, legitimately so. What are you building as an alternative? What is your plan as an alternative? What are you creating? Or do you simply want to see the downfall of the Iranian state, as you did in Syria? Because one thing revolutionaries need to also determine, beyond the fact of alternatives, the real blood that is shed, and decolonization is an inherently violent act, as Fanon teaches. There is no escaping that. It's violent at the level of identity. It's violent at the level of its ruthlessness. One thing that we don't think through is strategy versus tactics. Now, I'm very much against the butcher of Damascus insofar as Bashar al-Assad, absolutely. And I stand with my kin. But again, my kin did not learn from the previous kin so far as what happened in Egypt and what happened in Tunis, and Tunis is still a mess. Okay, in that particular instant, and if we're speaking about a revolution, then we need to also understand that at this moment, if you ask me with regards to Syria, I would say absolutely not. No, because the consequence in Syria would be, let's break Syria into different territories. The Sunni, the Shiite, the Kurdish, and so on. Same thing with Iraq. Something that is unacceptable to me. So what's the plan here? It doesn't mean that I condone Bashar al-Assad, me saying this in this particular moment. It means that the Qataris, the Wahhabi Salafis from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the Muslim Brotherhood, Israel that was treating al-Nusra Front fighters, Jabhat al-Sham now, as they refer to themselves, and so on and so forth, on the battlefield to return them to Syria, need to be taken into consideration by my so-called revolutionary project that I wish to see happen. So my problem is the fact that a lot of people in the West, in the Orientalist West, are fetishizing what they see elsewhere. Take the many white anarchists that go and join our Rohofa brothers and sisters insofar as the fight with the Kurds. Tell me, are there not enough monsters within US empire that you would have to go to a region that you know very little about? Why don't you simply stay here? And that's because you can't face the monster in the mirror. What about the ongoing indigenous genocide? What about the afterlife slavery projects, as Adia Hartman referred to it in the context of the very space in which you live? But this is Orientalism. So unfortunately, folks have not learned from what has been going on. And I would argue Sudan the same, and it stretches across the board. Unless one has, and again, we don't have to have all the answers, but you have to have a beginning from which you are beginning to lay down a foundation. I don't remember, again, and especially if we're talking about moving beyond liberalism and progressivism. And again, the liberalism is the Hillary Clinton, Obama, and so on type of politics, representational politics, but I also include progressives in that mix too, insofar as the AUC squad crowd, Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and so on and so forth. That isn't sufficient because you're still buying and building and assimilating and working off the fruits of labor for which the settler state settler colonialism as a structure is functioning, and you're allowing it to ongo and to continue, and at the expense of whom, might I ask? There's no way whereby Ilhan Omar would be flanked by Angela Davis and begins her speech where she says, this is a country founded on slavery, on genocide, but look at me, I made the example of the American dream. So what do my kin in Iran want? They want the fantasy of the American dream that doesn't really exist. They want the secular democratic state that doesn't exist. That becomes the question.
Well, thank you for that overview of the situations, and also I think, I mean, you touch on a lot of the ideas from the book that I want to like dig a little bit deeper in. Listening to that, though, I just like am thinking about this line from June Jordan's essay Report from the Bahamas, where she says, like, after we get rid of the monsters, we may all want to run in different directions, which I think is really the ultimate like test for so-called revolutionaries, because it's really hard not to want to or imagine that you have some answer or a better way of doing it and impose that on other people. And then there's the like coming down, sort of like what you spoke about is like there's a cathartic moment within a street protest or that involves direct action, could be violent or whatever. There's something that happens there that like seems like the seed of the revolution, but it doesn't have the sort of, I don't know, the material kind of continuity that would lead to a new world. And that's sort of like a place that I feel like we're stuck in rehashing in various places. But I also think that you're quite right thinking about whatever the, settler anarchists in the US aren't facing here when they talk about other struggles elsewhere. Like, I think about this a lot in terms of like Israel-Palestine and the way that gets talked about, and there is ongoing indigenous resistance in Turtle Island. And yet, like the way like settler anarchists talk about Israel doesn't sort of face their own complicity within our situation here on this land.
And settlers, as you know that, Scott, I mean, the thing with settlers, and white settlers in particular, look at the complicities not only within the context of settler colonialism, anti-indigenous and anti-black, because certainly, I mean, there's a lot to be said with regards to that, but the complicities also in imperialism. So there's a double responsibility there. I'm glad that you obviously brought up June Jordan, Fanon. The problem of the hegemony of hegemony, or a new elite class that would exercise. You see, it's very easy from a Marxist-Leninist perspective to take over institutions as opposed to construct alternatives, because then you have to think through, because, well, the institution represents that alternative that you're supposedly going to engage in some cleansing act with regards to, although it's going to be hierarchical, yada, 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 and reproduce a lot of authoritarian tendencies within itself, and so on and so forth. But this becomes a challenge because, as you just noted, decolonization is material. It has to deal with land. It is not a metaphor. It doesn't have to deal with dealing with school curriculums, decolonizing the academy, which is a colonial institution, decolonizing laws that are based on Protestant ethic, and so on and so forth. You can't decolonize what is colonially been established insofar as a governance, insofar as a mode of predatory, parasitic, I don't want to even say economic exchange, because there's a difference within our cultures and traditions insofar as markets and fair exchange versus capitalism, and what capitalism actually is. There's only integrated worldwide capitalism. And I'm sorry, like China, Russia, Cuba, nobody is exempt from that capitalist market, be it through development, be it through tourist industry. Sure, some are more of a planned economy manifestation than others, but all societies are capitalist. And that is the limitation of thinking within that statist framework to enact that change. What becomes necessary, or the choice is either one of two: you either invest in the dominant order or completely divest from it. Divesting means you need to organize. You need to organize the alternatives. You get to know people, which is very difficult within itself because of insecurities, because of fears, because of misconceptions that we've internalized, stereotypes, asymmetries of power that exist amongst us, and what happens if we fail, and the difficulty and challenges of actually creating common communities, solidarities, in which people are not tied together by some kind of national identity or some religious or racial belonging, but rather the ethical and political commitments that inform, that should have identified, that should have come with the identities that they embrace. queer. Somebody telling me that they're queer means absolutely nothing to me. You're an anarchist or a Muslim. What are the ethical political commitments that defines your queerness, your Islam, your anarchism? Because there are a lot of Zionist queers, let alone anarchists, let alone Muslims, as a matter of fact. So what are the ethical political commitments? It's not a matter of bending oneself or one's body to the sky 5 times a day as a Muslim when one is being a patriarch, a misogynist to their family, to their wife, yet is okay of looking at a white woman in predominantly non-Muslim society and being able to say, oh, hello back. But when it comes to a Muslim woman, oh, I'm not going to say salam alaikum because I need to supposedly lower my gaze. Right? So this is the kind of hypocrisy, unfortunately, that is very much ongoing. This hypocrisy also stretches in the context of migrant settlers of color, of which a lot are Muslims, absolutely. Right? And they go out in the streets and it's free Palestine. What about us being Zionist or tantamount to being Zionist on the stolen land? Because we reap the privileges. And sorry, there's an incommensurability between, as far as I'm concerned, and this is what the book posits, Islam, certainly, and the world, or that is constructed within the context of the settler colony itself in terms of values or cultures of whiteness, which we've all internalized. So to me, whiteness even extends beyond the color of skin. There are white Arabs, there are all kinds of white people that are also people of color. That's not the point. So thinking about the work that we have to do internally and collectively, the calling out mechanisms, because again, if we're talking about building community, that's very, very tough and difficult. We're going to have very difficult conversations as to what binds us, what makes us different, and how do we support one another, and what it is that we're building in the first place. So.
Yeah, I mean, so pulling on some of this and then getting into one of the main arguments of your book, like, I want to pull on this idea of decolonization and decolonial education as a main sort of force in this, because when you sort of start the book out in this kind of false choice between two different kinds of like Muslim identity, let's say, that is sort of created both by Islamophobia and a long history of Orientalism and colonialism, and the reaction to that within certain Muslim, spaces. And I think this speaks to what you were talking about how we end up recreating the hierarchies and institutions. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that dichotomy between the kind of liberal Muslim, who's looking for inclusion in the Euro nation state, and the reactionary fundamentalist, infantilized by Islamophobia.
Well, you and I know colonialism is violence. Before I come to recognize my name, the value of my name, my own traditions, my own cultures, my own language, I come to fetishize a skin that ain't my own, right? I learned to bleach my skin white because I want to look white. I want to appear white. I want to take on the civilizational values insofar as the dress code. I'm talking surface and depth here, at the level of the superficial surface, the maps on our faces, etc., but also the eyes insofar as the windows of the soul, and the depth insofar as our values. Because of that trauma, because of the hundreds of years of dispossession, literally so, that we have been very much ongoing through, I would argue really since 1492, not just in the context, and of course you know this, not in the context of just the US and Canada insofar as, actually the conquistador invasion of the Americas in general, starting with the Caribbean, and the significance of that date, and why hence we need a 1492 project and not a 1619, but also because what was going on the other side of the world insofar as Andalusia and the persecution of by Ferdinand and Isabel of Muslims and Jews, their murder, their forced conversion, and so on and so forth. So now we're talking hundreds of years, and not just since 1798, the Ottoman Empire collapse, and so on and so forth. We begin to see, and with particularly for Muslims, I think it was with each successive crusade, left particular imprints upon Muslims that only led to their further, if you will, arrogance, hegemony. I mean, there's a lot that can be said over the span of 1,443 years of Muslim history, and I don't mean to, again, engage in a reductionist evaluation of that history, because errors were made, in my humble opinion, very shortly after the Prophet, peace be upon him, had passed away. And we could sit down and get to that in a moment. But if we were to only consider from 1492 onwards, Those imprints that happened during the Crusades and that expanded only further with direct occupation of the Swana regions explicitly. And of course, there was resistance because, again, people of color have agency. But it often led and often manifested in two different forms that you noted, either fundamentalist or Orientalist. I want to be like the civilized Western other. There are many examples of that, including Muslims, migrant Muslims within the context of settler colonial societies in which we live. Or alternatively, because the degree of repression, suppression, oppression that we experienced, because of the lack of education, I'm going to subsequently engage in wanton, impotent violence that manifests itself as total, as all-occupying, and radiates in all directions against even my own kin. We certainly see it in the context of Iraq. We certainly see it in the context of Syria. Who would have imagined, I certainly did, and you're going to get a 3.0 and a 4.0, that ISIS would even condemn Al-Qaeda as being too soft. And the reason is, well, let me rephrase the whole reason thing, because obviously there is no reason, and I'm not condoning ISIS becoming ISIS. But I do ask my liberal Muslims this. If you're a Iraqi whose family had been murdered, your wife and your children have been killed, perhaps raped, your land has been dispossessed, you're living in poverty, you have no education, would you have joined ISIS? Maybe, maybe not. There was something that ISIS spoke to insofar as the collapse of the colonial borders between Iraq and Syria. We have to ask ourselves, why did hundreds of thousands, of course, again, supported by a lot of regional and geopolitical forces, migrate to this place? What attracted them? The problem with ISIS was the underpinnings of the dream of this Ummah that they wanted to establish. It's the ethical and political commitments within itself. And again, in order to understand that, you have to have the knowledge. You have to engage in education. If you don't, then you're only being or going to result, or your actions are only going to fall within, again, those two camps, fundamentalist, conservative. And there are a lot of those that exist, obviously, even in the context of the US, Canada, a lot of conservative Muslims that sit down, debase the US every single day. This is an infidel society. This is a kafir society. This is this and that. So my question to them, why don't you leave? And what is your complicity within this so-called infidel society insofar as, again, whose backs it is built upon? So there's a lot of, and again, Orientalist Muslims or liberal Muslims, let me say this, also engage in the same processes. Because within the context of settler colonialism, this is the interesting part. Settler colonialism does a lot of atrocity, but it does allow an avenue for the re-envisioning or the reimagination of one's own sense of identity. Because of the dreamy horizon that it offers, you're now in a society in which so-called freedom reigns. You can say, you can think, you can do whatever it is that you supposedly want, limited by choices as we all are. That becomes the issue, but it also becomes an opportunity to seize. The degree of, if you will, colonization even extends to when I get asked, why did you write this book? You know, and I mentioned the Orwellian theft of language. I'm talking language as it relates to land, as it relates to identity, as it relates to power, and so on and so forth. The degree of colonization is that if you stop a Muslim on the street and you ask him, what does Islam mean? In most likely of cases, 99%, the Muslim will respond back and say, oh, it means submission. Islam does not mean submission. Islam comes from the root salama, which means to willfully deliver, to deliver based hence upon intellect, upon choice, and to do so willfully, right? And not blindly in submissive, docile state, as the word submission would suggest. The word for submission actually in Arabic is khudu'. So this is the extent to which Muslims actually know their own language, even Arabic speakers. One can even draw on the concept or the non-existence of the concept of the state vis-a-vis a concept that Muslims took from the Quran, dawla, which doesn't mean state. And because we didn't have a word for state, they started to use it as the term for state. And so on and so forth. If you ask an Arab speaker, anarchy, obviously they will, or anarchism in Arabic is translated as la fawdawiyya, and most likely you will receive that response as to suggest chaos, disorder, and so on. Whereas the actual word for anarchism, or the actual translation, if you will, and hence we're talking about the politics of translation, mistranslation, Sabah Mahmoud, Joseph Mas'ad, Shireen Razak, and many others. The actual word is La Sultawiyya, without authority. So the crisis of language, the crisis of the absence of proper education, the complexity of the Quran and our religious traditions that demand a certain impetus and elevation of knowledge insofar as our own language, which we have been stripped away from because we're forced or compelled to learn English prior to learning Arabic, and many, many other reasons lead to these ostensible manifestations of either fundamentalist or Orientalist. I have to be a good Muslim citizen subject that is law-abiding, that capitulates to the nation state, even if it is a genocidal state, even as it is a enslaving state, in which I am a part of that enslavement within itself, that I shall pledge my allegiance to the almighty US, to defend its borders, to fight, if need be, by arms. It is part of the Pledge of Allegiance that is paid homage to, whereby liberalism is now crowned God. What does that do insofar as the concept of Tawheed within itself, which is the monotheistic concept that I, as a Muslim, should not worship anything or deify anything but God, the creator, not a nation, not a people, not a state, not a nothing. So that becomes the question. Do Muslims actually understand who they are and where they're headed? The crisis with Muslims is even worse. And I don't mean to romanticize indigenous people, but indigenous people have been sent to everything from not only had their land stolen and continue to experience ongoing genocide, the absence of clear water. We can even say that with regards to Flint, Michigan, black populations, and so on and so forth. But in residential schools, as I mentioned, the stripping away of their mother tongues, but hence they understood the power of their cultures, their traditions, their spirituality, and so on and so forth, and engaged in a kind of ijtihad of their own making. Muslims, what do we lack? We have our land, we have our territories, we're over 1 billion people. What do we lack? We have our resources. The Quran comes about and has entire chapters named after the chapter of the sun, the chapter of the moon, the chapter of the bees, the chapter of this, named after non-human life, other than human species. What should this indicate insofar as Muslims' commitments to ecosophy, insofar as global climate change, and so on and so forth? That becomes the dilemma. Unless Muslims strive and get to understand who they are once again and feel a great deal of pride and dignity, because if colonialism thieves anything, it is our ability to imagine ourselves anew. And hence we need to redream dangerously again. But we've been stripped of that pride of dignity with regards to our own traditions. No, I have to constantly, even leftist Muslims who are Marxist-Leninists, who constantly have to defer to Marxism. And I will include even Muslim anarchists, who constantly feel the need to defer to classical anarchism in particular without looking through their own traditions that arguably are inherently anarchistic. I love anarchism, including, of course, the classical anarchists, but it didn't start there. There are non-Western or non-Euro-American anarchisms that antecede and precedes classical European anarchism. So the horizon of imagination, the theft of that colonialism engages in, is also a contributing factor insofar as, the blindedness, the khushawa, whereby I either become a reactionary conservative because of the degree of psychoaffective trauma that I've experienced, the sense of loss, the sense of disorientation, the sense of wanting a just world but not knowing how to bring it about. And then I have mullahs and so-called imams and this and that doing the interpretation for me, and me becoming sheep, a follower of these wolves. And vice versa, the wolf of the settler state that I need to follow now and abide, because you know what? We need to be good hyphenated American citizens. Jewish American, Muslim American, Black American, Indian American, everybody is hyphenated except the white American, because they're supposedly the native. They're just Americans. But everybody else is trying to become part of this manifested so-called American dream. Sorry, ain't no American dream, as Malcolm called it many, many years ago. May he rest in power. It's an American fucking nightmare. Forgive my language.
Thanks for laying that out. And that made me think also just like, there's the legacy of like decolonization from the 50s and 60s. A lot of that gets romanticized from the leftist point of view. But again, it's like an example of recreating nations and the problems of states that you've been detailing. And I was also just thinking about like the kind of white fascism rising in the United States as another kind of like desperate, a place for desperate people to go, just like ISIS would be when you have no kind of way of figuring out how to act against the horrors of the life that you're, or just like losing the control over your life, even for more privilege, like, you know, even like poor white people in the U.S. That there's not really. Yeah, we get these like sort of false options. You mentioned the word that the term that you talk about in the book, the anarchist. You call it an anarchic ijtihad, is a sort of method of reading Islam, and I wanted to get to that. Like, what's the positive way that you're looking at how like a sort of forgotten tradition in Islam that isn't, as we are told so often, inherently authoritarian, violent, misogynistic, you know, homophobic or whatever, that there's an actual rich tradition buried in there, sometimes unseen, that you want to pull out of anti-authoritarianism, of communal care, and so on. Could you talk about the method that you're proposing, and also some of these like kind of core ideas that you see in the Quran and the teachings?
Thank you. Well, there are many Islams as there are, in a certain sense, Muslims. Okay. So I just want to take a step back, if you will, because you noted an important point that I think is worthy of at least stopping at, and that is the fantasy of the 50s and 60s and 70s insofar as decolonization and whether it actually happened or not. The master schools will never dismantle the master's house, not reload, right? And so the perception that third worldism, the Bandung conferences, Nasser, Tito, Nehru, Kwame Ture, and so on and so forth, or what was going on within Pan-Africanist and Pan-Arab thought and so on and so forth, was actually an internalization of that, I would say, not only of the master stool insofar as the nation state. I mean, Nasser at a certain point wanted to combine Egypt, Libya, and Sudan, because to him, if you drew actually around the borders of these three nations, and Egypt and Sudan were one nation prior to British partition and so on and so forth. And obviously the boundaries of Egypt have morphed tremendously over time, as all nations. But if you draw around it, you will get the image of a smaller Africa. And to him, Egypt represented the labor, Sudan, next to the Fertile Crescent, obviously, the land, and Libya represented the capital. So to him, he wanted to have this image of a smaller Africa. We saw an attempt insofar as a fusion between the state of Egypt and the state of Syria. That ended up collapsing. That didn't really last much for lots of different reasons, including geographic space. But if land reforms, or a few land reforms and a few gestures of women's rights, do not constitute or undermine the patriarchy of the states, because when we look at particularly the context of Egypt, well, these land reforms, it displaced the Nubian population that existed in Egypt twice. And the Nubians since then have not been able to return their land. And return to their land and carry out their rituals. And these are Muslims and Nubian Egyptians and so on and so forth. And they were displaced, obviously, with Sadat after that, and the building of the Nile Dam and so on and so forth. So that was just an important point. Decolonization means completely abandoning the master stools and looking back to your own traditions to establish different forms of governance and beyond the rhetoric of just socialism. Now, moving on to the question that you noted, and forgive me for that digression, but I do feel that was an important point to be made, given, as you noted, the romanticization of the 50s, the 60s, and so on and so forth. Anarchist jihad is a methodology that I use to discern ostensibly anti-authoritarian, anti-capitalist, and not just anti, because that's a rhetorical, but non-capitalist, non-authoritarian concepts and practices that exist vis-a-vis the Quran, because any Muslim or non-Muslim will say, well, come show me in the Quran where God says that I need to be an anti-capitalist or anti-sexist or anti-racist, etc. And what I want to do, or was out to do, is to provide a reading of the Quran for the oppressed, if you will. Quran for the meek. Quran the way that it was meant to be understood, because arguably all religious traditions, and I know this is a generalization, but I do feel it's a fair one, are built on foundations of social justice, period. Otherwise, you would not, if the idea of prophets was simply to come and to dictate to folks what to do and what not to do, nobody would have followed. There had to be an impetus towards justice that is established, such that you convince enough of a critical mass to join this movement And then after that, you can begin to set down the rules of the guidelines, and that becomes more acceptable to folks in such that they were able to fathom, to rationalize, to swallow, and to think through why certain things become forbidden, why certain things become kosher or halal. Now, anarchic ijtihad and the Quran doesn't just rely obviously on the Quran. It refers to the Sunnah insofar as the oral tradition, the practice of the Prophet ﷺ, the hadith, the oral tradition, but also it takes liberty in drawing on the thaqafa insofar as everything pertaining to Islam, insofar as 1,443 years of history. We're talking everything from, manuscripts on astronomy to the chemistry to biology to whatever it is that is relevant and that can be brought to the fore and to the contemporary present in order to build this pluriverse world, right? It's also hence keen on Muslim thaqafa and cultural consciousness that had been built over 1,443 years of Muslim history. Now, there are rules, of course, to ijtihad in general, relevant to anarchic ijtihad, and I talk about those rules. There's the rules with regard to the abrogation of certain verses, the context of certain verses. There are even verses that nobody knows the meaning of. The second chapter in the Quran, the chapter of the cow, begins with alif lam mim, three Arabic letters conjoined to form an Arabic word that nobody knows the meaning of. There are more blank spaces on a page than there is what is written as black. And that becomes the point. This capacity to interpret. Hell, if people can sit down and reinterpret Marxism in so many different dimensions and forms, we can certainly interpret it under our own traditions and have every right. So ijtihad is a right provided by God. There is this myth that at a certain point, the door to ijtihad was closed during the Abbasid era. Of course, that is not true because nobody can stop that process within itself. If I want to engage in ijtihad, if I then want to issue a fatwa, I can go ahead and do so. Whether somebody follows that fatwa, that's a different question. Salman Rushdie, for instance, the fatwa against him had been since Khomeini. Nobody had gone through with regards to that up until fairly recently. So it's a matter of, again, that determinate will, if you will, or whether people are convinced by the fatwa or not. People issue fatwas all the time. So that becomes something else or a different dimension. But the idea becomes to go through the Quran as an Arabic speaker, to focus on the etymology, the ontology, the categories that are created. For instance, the Quran in so many ways, of course, addresses Muslims and refers to in so many verses, Ya ayyuhal muslimina wal muslimat. But in so many verses, it also refers to Ya ayyuhal mu'minina wal mu'minat, or believers. And there are verses in which Yahud, wal Nasara, and the Sabians, in which the Jews, the Christians, are being told, or themselves, let alone to Muslims, that they are safe on the day of power, that they are believers, that they have fulfilled their covenant in relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that becomes a question. The category of mu'min, of believer, what defines the ethical political commitments insofar as mu'min? Who and what is a believer? And what, on the other side, defines the kafir, the infidel? Now, if we look etymologically, let alone ontologically, epistemologically on the Quran, the kafir is defined as the one that desecrates the earth, destroys the land, engages in israf, in waste, steals the wounds of the orphan, of the poor, treats women in ill ways, and so on and so forth. This redefines the moniker, the identity of who and what is a Muslim in the first place, let alone who and what is a believer. One is able to then categorize and establish, again, certain actions, certain ethics that are related to certain categories, and hence be able to do this remapping of, again, the Muslim, the believer, the kafir, and so on and so forth. This becomes a part of the process, and of course, I proceed within the book in order to talk about concepts or anti-authoritarian or non-authoritarian concepts of Tawheed. For instance, it's a concept in which I just mentioned, if I worship Allah, the Creator, of which the extension is creation, I shall worship no other master, no nation, no state, no blood ties, not my tribe, not my community, not my children. I shall not run after money. I shall not deify anything, right? I only worship the commitments, the social justice commitments that Allah commanded in the Quran, because Allah said very openly, and I'm paraphrasing here, if we wanted to create you all as one nation, we could have done so. ولكن the verse continues خلقناكم من شعوب وقبائل لكي تتعارفوا وأحسنكم عند الله أتقاكم. But we created you from different tribes and different nations so that you may get to know one another. And the best amongst you are those that exercise taqwa. But what is taqwa? As in piety, where does it tie to? Social justice, ethical political commitments in terms of fairness, in terms of adalah in the world. So, Tawheed. Then we find a chapter called the chapter of Shura, the chapter of mutual consultation. How can that not be an anti-authoritarian concept? It is right there as a chapter, very much in line with anarchism so far as mutual consultation. Then we have ijma', community consensus. Then we have maslaha, what is good for the collective welfare of the community within itself, and so on. Islam neither tries to be nepotistic in the sense that, on the far end communist scale, nor at the same time viciously parasitic, as at the other side of the capitalist scale, because there are reservations for the responsibilities and rights of the individual and the autonomy of the individual, so long as they do not trespass the collective goods of the community within itself, and while practicing, again, a kind of community engagement, a kind of consensus, a kind of ijtihad, a kind of responsibility for the other consistently, constantly, and continually. Of course, then I talk about the authority, or if you will, the place of the Prophet. Muhammad is nothing but a prophet, of which prophets came before them. So Muhammad's role becomes also limited. They are a messenger, they are a prophet, they are a Rasul, and they are Nabi, to convey a message. It is not the fault of God or Islam or Muhammad, the fact that the message has been tainted and misconstrued. That becomes vital to not only understand, but to also understand the place of the Prophet insofar as their positioning. The Prophet exercised all the anti-authoritarian concepts and practices that I just noted, all of them, consistently and constantly. Because again, the idea was to build a revolutionary community. While Muslims were being persecuted, while they were in Mecca, with the majority Qurayshi polytheist community around them, persecuting them, killing them, and as they migrated first to Medina and then after that to Abyssinia, right? Under the protection of King Najus, who is Christian and then later converted to Islam on his deathbed. That becomes, which is modern day Ethiopia, Abyssinia, for those who don't recognize the term. And then there's the authority of God, right? Which becomes important to talk about. But Islam is very clear, and the Quran is very clear. There is no compulsion in religion. What would be the point of compelling somebody to believe in something that they don't necessarily believe in, out of fear, that would defy even the purpose of that God wanting that person to believe in the first place, let alone the intent of belief, right? So those are some of the pillars of what I refer to as an anti-authoritarian, a non-authoritarian Islam, if you will. And then I begin to build, of course, the anti-capitalist, non-capitalist tenets of Islam, the redefining of property, because property is not conceived the same way within Islam, arguably, as in capitalism, right? Because in Islam, al-mulk lillah, all property belongs to Allah, including our own physical bodies, what we do with them, and so on and so forth, let alone non-human life, let alone the resources within the land that belong to all of the community to decide on what to do with them. Natural resources are not to be bought and sold. We're talking about water. We're talking about natural resources. Everybody ought and reserve a place insofar as a quality of life and not just a standard of living. Then I begin to talk about Ramadan, fasting, what it means insofar as solidarity with the poor, zakah that is paid, in which it's not just alms, but it is the right of the poor over the rich. And the way that it's given is not through a third-party intermediary, but has to be given by hand, face-to-face, so that creates that kind of solidarity and affinity and a feel for the plight of the poor. Buyut al-mal, which used to be, if you will, centers that housed resources, food, money, if you will, for the poor to simply go and take what it is that they need, simply so they won't be driven to sit down and beg and feel the plight and the humility, dignity, wise, insofar as being homeless on the streets and having to beg for a right, a human right that everybody should be afforded. There is debt forgiveness that exists within Islam, debt cancellation, because that is a commandment. In fact, it's extolled in the Quran that one forgives debt. There is the forbiddance of interest, which is strictly admonished within the Quran, within itself, a primary pillar of capitalism. And yeah, sadaq al-fitr and so on and so forth, So yeah, there's the contemporary sort of play on buyut al-mal with Islamic banks. But as I noted before, and as I noted in the text, Islamic banks, as much as the model within itself is interesting, but it also represents like an island of halal, if you will, or kosher-ness in an ocean of haram. So it actually does nothing. I mean, it's very interesting how the model does seek a kind of consensus, a kind of partnership, There's also the cooperative model that exists between sort of the lender and the borrower and the person doing or the entity doing the lending, et cetera, a shared risk factor, and so on and so forth. But I also begin to talk about concepts like mudaraba and musharaka insofar as shared partnerships, as well as the fact that we as Muslims or as human beings, are khalis. We are all caretakers of God's property on earth. And that is it. None of us per se own anything in the quintessential understanding of ownership within itself. So these are some of the concepts and practices that sort of I extract from the Quran, from Islam in general.
The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
Hello, and welcome to We Will Remember Freedom, a monthly podcast of anarchist fiction. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. Hello, and welcome to Live Like the World is Dying, your podcast for what feels like the end times. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. Hello, and welcome to the jingle for both of my podcasts. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. You can find my podcasts wherever you get your podcasts or get them from the Channel Zero network.
If you would like to support The Final Straw, you can subscribe to our podcast via various platforms, follow and share our materials online, as well as give us feedback via the links at tfsr.wtf/tree, as in Linktree. To support our transcription work and wider project, you can subscribe to us via patreon.com/tfsr. You can also buy some merch or find donation methods at tfsr.wtf/support.
Yeah, I mean, I love the way that you... this is something I think about a lot, is like what makes a sort of approach or a reading of something anarchist. And you boil it down in a way that it's like, it's something I think about, and it's the same place I arrive, right? Is like, all it takes is kind of looking at something and thinking about how do I engage this to promote sort of, mutual care and responsibility and freedom to and autonomy. And that seems like sort of something you're saying is extremely like threaded through the history of Muslim thinking and practice and writing. And I just love that you bring it out that way, and the way you detail it's very clear. And also just thinking about in the history of like, I don't know, at least the three major monotheistic religions that we kind of live under, they all have this sort of story of like being this like group that was persecuted and was trying to find some kind of safety for themselves, and then went on to kind of do atrocious things in various ways. But like I really think that's a helpful way of thinking, like forming a community that is like, maybe a minority and under the threat of violence as a way to seek social justice, and in that founding moment thinking of how do you deal with other people that aren't the same as you? Like those two lines that you quote them in the book too of, I could have just created everyone the same, but I didn't, right? So, I mean, that's like, it's yeah, I mean, I just think those lines are really beautiful. It's interesting to think about like what gets lost. So like one of the major points that you look at in the book, or one of the major terms, I guess, is a better way of saying it, is Umah, right? And like this idea of like, of community that can get sort of translated into ideas of state or nation. And I wonder if maybe you could tell me what an anarchist ummah in your interpretation of Islam is, and then how it gets like framed sort of in a more, I don't know, fascist or macro fascist kind of way.
So thank you. And again, it's very enjoyable talking with you, Scott, because the element of pluriversality, in a certain sense that you just noted just in your last set of comments, and look, all we learn from oppression is learning how to repeat it unless we decolonize. And the irony is all these monotheistic traditions started up as oppressed collectivities, right? Prior to arrogance, rule, and power seducing and, in a certain sense, corrupting the original heart and message. So the intent and the action behind it. It's difficult to talk about the Ummah without talking about the Dawla. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to say a few things with regards to the Dawla.
Yeah.
Just because of a lot of the misconceptions. So, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, like I said earlier, they often repeat sort of and promote the dehistoricized view that there's such a thing as an Islamic state. There is no such thing as a state that existed in pre-modernity simply because it's a Euro-colonial invention within itself. But we did not have the word for state. So Arabs and predominantly Arabic speakers, let alone Muslims now in general, will use the post-colonial term dawla to mean state when it actually does not mean state. Even ISIS refers to itself as a dawla Islamiyya. So much for a Muslim movement that was out to change the world, that knows and claims that it was an authentic kind of Islam, actually knowing who and what it is, to use the concept of Islamic state, let alone a dawla Islamiyya. So obviously this represents a distortion of dawla's meaning. Dawla stems from the verb dal, which morphically as well as semantically falls between two verbs, dar and zal, which means to rotate and to go away. So the exact temporality is a part of the understanding of it. And usually what we had within pre-modern Muslim modes of governance, several dawlas even within one dawla. It represented a confederate model, if you will, decentralized, that all composed a part of this ummah, broadly speaking. But they mostly rotated around, like I said, connotations of temporality, change, rotation, nothing as much as a fixed order that aspires to, or at least the modern state aspires to. So that's essential. The condition of well-being, or the change and alteration of well-being from one person to another or between groups. One day I have my health, the next day I don't. That's part of the understanding of the dawla. It's subject to change. We can find it in chapter 59, chapter of the gathering, verse 7. The Prophet's distribution of the spoils of war referred to as a dawla in a certain sense. Do not hoard the spoils within only an enclave of you. Distribute it amongst the community in its entirety. And the same thing with other verses in the Quran, the chapter of the House of Imran, for instance, verse 140, that discusses the cyclical nature that I noted of human vicissitudes, insofar as triumphant days were usually replaced by defeat another. So it ultimately means to turn, to alternate, but not to be fixated. It doesn't have a static place, organization. Like I said, there are a multiplicity of dawlas within one dawla, loosely referred or establishing a decentralized confederacy under the rubric of a so-called ummah within itself. Now, a dawla cannot ferment an ummah. And, an example of dawlas that existed, for instance, there was the Hamdanite, there was the Buayyid, yes, the Shidi, the Ayyubi, the Mamuli dawlas, right? Within the Abbasinian Ummah, if you will, during that time, and Muhammad Ali and Ali Bey Kibirs within the Uthmani Ummah, right? But the fact that you had a seat in Damascus did not mean that you had a Syria, or you had a seat in Baghdad did not mean that you had an Iraq within itself. The Ummah within itself is, because the Quran did not, and God did not lay down, and this is so fascinating because the concepts I talked about earlier are micro anti-authoritarian concepts, right? The Quran did not lay down a macro structure of governance. It left things loose. It placed the idea of dawla there, and it placed the idea of ummah. You want this non-territorial concept. Why? Because Islam is a message to the world. So it is seeking, and Muslims should be seeking, engagement with those who are like and are unlike them. Okay, with the spirit that we talked about earlier, insofar as the process of getting to know. If we take that as a foundation and the Ummah structure itself was left loose. And what we saw for the most part through 1,443 years is a decentralized model that existed organically there. Sure, there was nepotism, sure, there was despotism, and so on and so forth, and gradual hegemony that fed into. But we have to distinguish between what the decentralized confederacy also allowed. It allowed mobility. There were no politics of citizenship, of surveillance. There were no controlled societies, disciplinary societies in the way that we understand them now. You can contest a despotic ruler by coming up with an interpretation of Islam that would expose that ruler's corruption, and so on and so forth. So there was far more means to resist. Power is far more malleable than it is now. It's far more fluid. The idea of the Ummah that I am drawing upon is the first Ummah, the first polity that was established, that the Prophet, peace be Muhammad, peace be upon him, established, which is founded on the Medina Charter and the treaties of Hudaybiyah or Sulh al-Hudaybiyah. It was a multi-faith community, included Jews, Christians, Sabians, even polytheists, in which what bound this community together are the ethical, political, social justice responsibilities that they had with one another. This was also underneath the understanding of what I spoke about earlier, insofar as there was a nuanced conceptualization amongst the early polity of it is not a matter of a Muslim, non-Muslim, because the person before me is a believer. If I choose them as part of my ummah, and they're included, that they are a believer, they are a mu'min, whether they believe in exactly the same, whether it's they're referred to as, forgive me, Yahweh or Adonai or Allah or Jesus or Buddha or Mother Earth, whatever it is, that's a name. And what's in a name? Nothing and everything. The everything comes precisely because of the ethical, political commitments that Buddha, that Yahweh, that Allah, that whatever would have us believe in. And so if we begin to think about now, the Ummah constructed from that perspective, a common community, a community that has a porous membrane such that it's able to expand, it's able to grow, it's able to mature vis-a-vis folks that are coming in and folks that are leaving at the same time equally. And as this community interacts with other communities, because the Ummah is often misinterpreted also as a nation, which is highly problematic because, again, the concept of nation within itself doesn't exist except in contemporary Arabic lexicon. The Quran used the words qaba'il and shu'ub. Qaba'il are small tribes. Shu'ub are larger populations. So there was an indicative of these being more quantitative qualifiers than they were qualitative, and an appreciation for the fact that even small communities, even small tribes are worthy of not only engagement and interaction and exchange with, but if need be, protection from other communities that would oppress those small tribes. And hence that sense of collective responsibilities that folks would share with one another. So that becomes the idea of the community. It is one that existed during the early Muslim period, unfortunately, and it began gradually, of course, to become misconstrued, right? For instance, we see with the idea of the Dhimmite or the Dhimmi, right? Jews being dressed in particular garbs as Dhimmite. Now, the Dhimmi is a beautiful concept because the Dhimmi means one whose life, whose neck, if you will, lies within my hands. So it is worthy of protection, right? But then we begin to see gradually Muslims, this is 1,000 years later, 1,200 years, wanting to dress Jews or non-Muslims in different garbs in order to distinguish themselves from Muslims and so on and so forth. And the beginning of misconstruing again of concepts of, beautiful concepts of, towards ulterior motives that are meant to other and not create an affinity towards, but to create as outcasts, to mark them, to mark their bodies, to mark their traditions, their ways of being and existing within the world. So yeah, that's the concept generally, loosely of, if you will, of Ummah, because the concept of Caliphate doesn't, as well, and this is worthy of mentioning, doesn't exist. Again, Caliphate is a derivative of the concept of Khalifas, and we're all Khalifs in the Quran. The Quran certainly uses Khulafa in the plural just as much as it's used in the singular. But Abraham, peace be upon him, was described as an Ummah unto themselves. So the Ummah is a very, also beautiful concept and term, as far as, again, that extrapolation of what it means for an individual, let alone a body, a communal body, to embody particular or to embrace particular ethical political commitments, if you will. grounded in, of course, social justice.
Yeah, well, that makes me think another sort of strand that you pull out, and it recurs in the book, is this idea of hospitality. And I think this really connects to what you were just talking about. So I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on that from an anarchist Muslim point of view, and like sort of, and maybe if you have some thoughts about how we could infuse an anarchistic Muslim hospitality into our daily practices, whether or not we're, Muslim.
Well, the crisis, within the left, as you know, my dear, is the fact that we're brilliant at tearing each other apart. The right doesn't actually have to worry about anything in that respect. They maintain always this unified stance, regardless of MAGA, regardless of Iraq wars, regardless of whatever it may be, right? The left, no. And so for a while now, for about more than 15 years ago, I started to work on what is referred to within Islam as usul al-ikhtilaf and usul al-diyafa, the ethics and politics of disagreement and the politics of hospitality, if you will. How do you offer hospitality to the other? And of course, I draw on Jacques Derrida, the beautiful Jewish Algerian Derrida, who faced everything from obviously anti-Jewishness in France to let alone in Algeria itself. So he got hated on both sides of the world. But I also draw on Leila Gandhi, on a lot of other thinkers, if you will, within the process of hospitality. In Islam, there is such a thing as the ethics of hospitality. Insofar as how do you offer hospitality to the other? Part of it begins with, we need to do away with these Zoom kind of chat discussions, because this is no forum for, well, it is. Any forum could be used. But can you imagine if we were face to face? If I entered your home and you entered mine, how the conversation ostensibly, in a very Artudian way, would have been different. Our gestures in terms of saying hello, the ability to embrace, how we would be seated down, the affect of all that, the offerings of gestures of food, of water, of sustenance, right? Expressions of love, the ability to look the other in the eye and connect, such that you don't have to sit at the end of the day across from a dinner table and say, honey, what's wrong? Say something. Out of this fear, this compulsion to speak. It involves things as you don't demand the other's name. The other's name is to be given willfully. It needs to be surrendered. It means that when you are my guest, you are the owner of the home. It means the switch of the playing of the roles. Insofar as a diyafa, you become, in a certain sense, the commander of, if you will, the house, right? Whatever it is that you need. It's, at least traditionally, it's for 3 nights, if you will, and so on, that act of hospitality. But obviously, I don't want to read into things too literally. Of course, it could be 3 nights. It could be longer than that if we're building community. But we need to give ourselves space, time, which we don't allow within movement organizing, to actually get to know one another. How many times have we been to protests, say Iraq war and Afghanistan war, even with regards to what's going on in Iran or otherwise? I can guarantee you, and I said this before, the anarchists that went out during the anti-war Iraq, Afghanistan protests, how many of them went to a mosque? How many of them picked the Quran? How many of them have spent time with Muslims? How many of them have cooked meals or broke bread with Muslims? How are you supposed to claim that you're engaged in solidarity? Again, I appreciate the gesture of going out on the streets and being allies that way. But there's no investment in relation. Investing in relation means I have to create the space, the time, the opportunity for the process of getting to know, let alone to have an ethics of disagreements by which conflict resolution can begin to manifest and to take place. Because no two people were aligned 100%. Insofar as their ethical political commitments. Say I meet another anarchist, or say they meet me, and I'm anti-capitalist, I'm anti-racist, and anti-authoritarian. But you know what? With regards to the queer stuff, I can't really. I'm not on board with that. I'm not on board with the trans stuff, right? The other party has to decide at this point: do we have enough bonds of affinity, and am I willing to be patient with Muhammad such that they understand the relevance and importance of gender and sexuality and intimacy and so on and so forth? And how much patience and time should I give Muhammad? Because as Derrida posits, we can't just have our doors open to everybody. One would not invite the rapist, the misogynist, etc. But if none of us are pure, we have to allow room for that morphing, that metamorphosis of the self, indeed our becoming. And that becomes the capacity. There is no ideal Muslim. The ideal Muslim is Muhammad. Muhammad died. He left us the practice. And they have left us the oral tradition. But we're also always striving to be ideal Muslims. But we're never going to reach. There is no ideal anarchist, even if you consider, as I was told by a classical anarchist, actually in a conference, and this is true, in Loughborough many years ago. Emma Goldman and Bakunin and Kropotkin, in the context, I can tell you the context. He asked me one of the first times that I was presenting on Islam and anarchism. This is an anarchist that came into the conference dressed in a suit, tie, everything, white, of course. And he says, well, last week we made a whole bunch of effigies of Moses, of Jesus, of Muhammad, and we burnt them. And what is your opinion with regard to that? This is over 12 years ago. And I said, well, I neither know what Moses or Jesus or Muhammad look like besides the blonde, blue-eyed Jesus, but I don't mind that Jesus, but sure. But I don't know what Muhammad looked like. If that gives you some sort of cathartic satisfaction, okay, but I obviously would not do that with, if you will, our elders. I wouldn't do that with Emma or Bakunin. He's like, yeah, because these are our gods. So much for no gods, no masters. So, but that mentality, even if we are to assume that Emma, Bakunin, Kropotkin, and again, they were incredible subjects, subjectivities, personalities that existed. Ethically, politically staunch with regards to social justice that appeared in a particular historical period and of Jewish background. And we could sit down and talk about sort of the secularization of that and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, that embodied certain commitments. But nobody is perfect. And then even in that case, one is aspiring to be like Emma, like Bakunin, like Kropotkin, like whatever. So there's no ideal stage at which one arrives. One is constantly in the process, like I said, of metamorphosis, especially if we can see that I have to fight all my inner fascisms, period. Somebody who's white has to deal with the same with regard to their white privilege or whatever else privileges that they have going on. So that becomes, as I noted, the idea, if you will, insofar as the ethics of disagreements. And I number them, I believe 4 or 5 in an essay that I wrote that got published in the Journal of Political Theology. You know, they happen because of ego, they happen because of ideology, they happen because of ignorance and other reasons. But ideologies don't exist. No tradition, as much as even religion. And again, I'm very careful because we didn't get into the discussion of the difference between religion, faith, and spirituality. These are different concepts. They're interrelated within the Quran, but they're not one and the same thing. And institutionalized versus non-institutionalized religion, particularly in the context of Judaism and Islam, because we don't have a central authority, we don't have a priesthood, and we certainly don't have a church. You know, so what that ostensibly then also means in terms of the ramifications and the repercussions of that. So it is reflecting through all these processes of Muslims may claim that Islam responds to everything, but as Islam is in engagement with the world. A non-human life is an extension of creation and it interacts back. This is a non-thinking religion. And you have to apply it. And it depends on space, time, and hence ethics, and not just moralities. And here I mean by, thou shalt not kill or the 10 commandments. Of course, these are general, beautiful commandments. But God forbid if somebody threatens you or I in this particular instant or moment in which we are sort of collectively together, we reserve the right to self-defense. What that manifests as, we can restrain this person, we use a knife, we use whatever it is, means that are necessary, that's a whole different other question. But it becomes a question of context, of ethics, and not morality. Moralities are nice. They're general commandments that we should abide by. But we have to leave room for ethics, and hence the ethics of disagreements and hospitality that way. And we lack them. We lack that kind of investment, and beyond the liberal, multicultural, interfaith initiatives, and all that really just reinforce the greater macro-fascisms and totalitarian orders that already exist.
So there's so much I want to talk to you about, but there's 2 questions I definitely want to get to, and maybe these will be the sort of last, because we're just make this digestible for our listeners. But
Thank you.
So from what you're saying, and both of my questions really connect to what you were just saying. So, but one of the major sort of revolutionary liberatory projects of the book is grounded in a decolonial sort of land-based liberatory project that for you is really important to draw wisdom and solidarity from indigenous movements with diasporic people like Muslims, Jews, and black people who are descendants of people from the Atlantic slave trade. Yeah, I want to know a little bit more of that vision that you see, where indigeneity and diasporic sort of identities can find connection, and then what the role of the land is in relation to that, And that might connect also to your ideas of hospitality too. I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much. No, that's a brilliant question. So, indigeneity. I don't read indigeneity as a racial concept. And it's very dangerous, in my opinion, to read it as such. I distinguish, of course, between indigenous peoples, indigenous nations, and indigeneity. I think indigeneity I relate to the concept of fitra within Islam, the inclination to do and being born as good, the inclination to connect with community. When was the I and I? When I was a wee within my mother's womb. That was socialized as this individualist, narcissistic I, this materialist I. So our inclination is to connect with community, it's to connect with non-human life. Prior to us being dressed in pink or blue in a hospital, styrated space, and so on and so forth. So compartmentalization of identities, slotting, acting in authoritarian ways insofar as, okay, I see Scott, I can categorize Scott, I can slot him, I understand my power relationships with them, and I don't need to invest anymore in the getting to know process in the act of hospitality. As migrants, and this is why I tell the story of the original migration and persecution of Muslims. When Muslims moved to Abyssinia, first to Medina, then modern-day Ethiopia, and this is part of not only the getting to know, but building a revolutionary community. Why were Muslims not allowed to respond while they were being persecuted? And the verse is that I'll permit them to engage in qital, not jihad, but actually qital, which is the literal word for war or battle, if you will. Why was it revealed after Muslims had been decimated? So that they may learn the greater importance of a lesson. That, of course, as the Quranic verse says, migrate, of course, if you're being persecuted, and go and establish relations with people on whose lands you are now moving to, and relative to them, and find your common commitments together, and build that community together. That is far more important. And then the right to self-defense, that's easy. It's easy to pick up a gun. It's far more difficult to learn how to grow food with a community on land that is not yours, and to grow food more than your literal or our little narcissistic gardens that we have in our backyards, if we even have backyards. So this idea of migration, I understand that Muslims, and a lot, are suffering. They come from everywhere, from Afghanistan to Iraq. They are queer Muslims from Egypt. Some who have internalized Islamophobia, they want nothing to do with Islam. Some who remain Muslims, but are now moving to the context of settler colonial US and Canada. And I've seen it happen both ways, whereby folks completely let go of the responsibilities. They embrace the free lifestyle. They go out drinking, partying. And again, I could care less for that sort of a narrative. People deserve leisure. They can do whatever it is that they want. But it's the abdication of responsibility, whether you buy into leisure or not, that I find to be highly problematic. And whether you're a Palestinian or not, we're ultimately settlers on stolen land. What becomes the responsibility insofar as the getting to know? How many Muslims have been to reserves, have even spoken to an indigenous person or nation? This becomes the issue, and this becomes the problem. The fact that we have not invested, the fact that we have internalized anti-Blackness within our Swana communities and reproduced that anti-Blackness, the complexity of anti-Blackness. If we take Israel as an example, Black Mizrahi, Ashkenazi, Sephardic, now oppressing Black Palestinians, let alone non-Black Palestinians. It's complicated. We live in a complicated world. But this is where the investments in relations becomes very vital. So as migrants, I would extol Muslims who have brought into the narratives of hyphenated American citizenship, of assimilation, of representation, professional or not, within the hierarchies of the state, let alone within racial capitalism, to sit down and to actually begin to think through the responsibilities, such that when they go out and they protest in the name of Palestine, perhaps they may realize the hypocrisy in what it is that they're demanding, because there is no free Palestine, not from the river to the sea. The road to Jerusalem runs through the Grand River and vice versa. It's as simple as that. There's a lot of literature that's obviously been written, Dan Alwan, Stephen Shalaita, Mike Krebs, and one can go on and on, of the resonances that exist, not mapped out identically, because no two things are, or two situations are, resonance between what is going on insofar as Palestine, insofar as indigenous dispossession here. And the society relies on its pillars of anti-indigenous dispossession, genocide, land, cultures, traditions, languages, resurgence, and anti-blackness. And yes, as you noted, it's ironic that, a third and fifth of the transatlantic slaves were Black Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula and west coast of Africa. So the fact that we're engaged in this kind of anti-blackness is obviously very sickening. And one sees it even in the context of Egypt and blackface and so on and so forth. But that's part of Egyptians or North Africans even fighting for the right to be recognized as whites within the US Constitution, within the census, and so on and so forth, at the early turn of the 19th century, if you will. So, and it was Coptic Egyptians actually that led to that led that battle, having been persecuted in the context of Egypt. So this is a reproduction of oppression, and if we're going to break that cycle, we need to engage in that decolonial, material, land-based resurgent act where land is returned to its proper stewards. And it's not for the sake that indigenous people can kick everybody back on the boats from which they came. Indigenous people are far more dignified and respectful than that. But such that we learn to eat from the same dish with the same spoon. This becomes the element of sharing, of reciprocity, of getting to know, and of investment. That takes time. And you're not going to do that within the so-called, per se, urban metropolis, because reses don't exist within the urban metropolis, despite the migration or displacement, if you will, of a lot of indigenous people because of poverty and for all sorts of other reasons, into their urbanization, if you will, into the metropolis. So it has to deal with moving about with fantasies with regards to cosmopolitanism, with regards to skyscrapers, the geographies of land, how land itself is being organized, what the organization of land does insofar as defining what is private and what is public. In Islam, that is very salient. Now we live in a day and age in which privacy doesn't exist. There's a camera post-Snowden age that exists on every single cell phone. We're mined, we're digitized, we're harvested. We're numbers on a machine or for a machine. So the investment means that you're ostensibly, and to me, solidarity means that those that you're standing in solidarity with, you are prepared to die because their causes are yours. And you're doing so in the name of not only their name, but your name as well. Because I, as a Muslim, cannot accept that I come over here, that I get a job, I get an education, I have access to OSAP, I have access to a good quality of life, medical care, otherwise, that an indigenous person would not have access to. As they're, again, lacking clear water in every place from Atapawaskat, or committing suicide, because that exists too, youth or indigenous youth. So that becomes the concern at this point. It is not a matter of rhetoric, it is a matter of investment, and the land needs to be returned. And Muslims can contribute alongside with indigenous people to develop, as indigenous people's traditions have, a different form of governance, horizontalist governance, that isn't interested in recuperating the nation state or using the nation state as a tool for liberation, not for them and certainly not for other people. And of course, Afro-Indigenous futurities are very much intertwined, because transatlantic slaves didn't have a choice in coming here. They are the only community or only group that is exempt, in my humble opinion, from being referred to as settlers, because they're not. They were forcibly displaced, transplanted on the bottom of slave ships, with millions that are dying at the bottom of the ocean, that extends as part of the process of what Christina Sharp refers to as that wake, or even Tiffany Letabo King calls the shoal, that extended shoal that bridges sort of land and sea, right? That extension of oppression, of repression, but also agency of resistance. So Muslims can either join. The irony and the problem is that we're all on the same boat. We can see the Titanic. We can see the icebergs headed right before us, and we're headed for them anyways. And by that, I mean global warming or climate change. Look, it's not going to matter to the earth or Mother Earth, whether we are Muslims, Jews, whether we are leftists or conservatives or whatever it is. Climate change is going to do what it is, and our Mother Earth is going to do what she wills. And it's been happening for quite some time. So what can we do? How can we not just center indigenous voices within our discussions, our analyses, our lives, the way that we live off the land instead of getting and buying our groceries from supermarkets or what have you? How can Muslims come to recognize the indigeneity that exists within their own cultures, traditions, and how can we build on that indigeneity from different perspectives? How can we, going back to that statement that the Zapatistas taught me, holding each other's hands, we teach one another what each of us knows, because the reality is we also have traitors within our own communities. We have the Obamas, we have the Oprah Winfreys, we have a lot. there is that mini Obama and mini Trump that exists also inside each of us. And we do have sellouts. And we have to reconcile then that resurgence is not a matter of numbers, because it's not a matter of mass mobilizations. The Panthers were not great in numbers, but they were a dedicated few. They knew exactly what they want despite the mistakes that the Panthers had made, too, in terms of leadership, in terms of patriarchy, in terms of authoritarianism, and so on and so forth. So it does require a people or a small minority that know the relations, or are interested in knowing their kin and on the land and investing on the land and returning that land and building on the land those coming community within itself. And some will be indigenous, some will be black, some will be Jewish, some will be Muslim, some will be Christian, and so on and so forth. But it isn't going to be a simple, unison, homogeneous community either. Know the territories that you're on, I would say Muslims, understand the histories of the treaties of the land that you're in, the particular geography, and begin to build with indigenous and radical black and indigenous, and don't take the easy way out. Do not take the easy way out of saying, I'm going to change things from within. Having Debbie Haaland as Minister of Interior does absolutely nothing in the end, insofar as, again, the repatriation of indigenous lands and the honoring of over 600 or over 500 treaties that have been broken by the U.S. government. And that is the U.S. government on its own, let alone the empty acts of reconciliation that occur up north in Canada. So where has reconciliation got Canadians and all the Muslim-loving people that wear orange shirts on the day to commemorate missing and murdered Indigenous and Aboriginal women, and so on and so forth? Beyond that, what are we doing? If these were our children, would we accept the fact that they were being excavated from graveyards, or the refusal of even their excavation for graveyards? That becomes the concern. That becomes the issue. Stop holding on to your celebrity activists, let alone professional politicians, let alone celebrities, be they football players or whatever else that they may have to say with regards to social justice. The real heroes are out on the ground. It's not Greta Thunberg, and I'm not meaning to pick on a blonde-haired, blue-eyed teenager, but there is a reason that she took the limelight and not the indigenous land defenders that have been working on the reclamation of land and land back for decades, if not centuries, because that is their demand. So yeah, and part of that is abolition, of course. Part of that is reparations also, not only for slavery, but also imperialism that existed everywhere from, Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan and so on and so forth. It is total, and either there's justice for everybody or there's justice for nobody, as far as I'm concerned. But it does require that we dream dangerously. It does require that we take bold acts. It does require that we no longer fear the ramifications of perhaps losing our lives, because guess what? People will die in revolutionary situations, and that's okay. But old grass has to die for a new grass to grow, and that is the reality. At least we stop kicking the can down the road, this endless postponement, Kafkaesque, of judgment, the trial. It's atrocious. We might as well rip the Band-Aid off and suffer the consequences, but also think through the solutions as we do so at the same time. That's the kind of investment. It is sitting down around the fires when you're on a res, listening, learning, not being afraid to commit mistakes or engage in mistakes, because that's a part of learning too. There's no shame in that whatsoever. And it's not about being shamed either vis-a-vis atrocious calling out mechanisms that particularly exist within radical communities. Sorry, that was a long response. A lot of responses have been to your question, but I do find your questions to be incredibly enthralling. So.
No, I mean, that was great. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, you gave a lot of thoughts, and I think that's really helpful for thinking about where to dig in. So I'll ask one last question, if that's okay, that maybe takes us back to some of the stuff from the beginning, but also connects to a word that in the Islamophobic, press is often associated with Islam, jihad, right? But you give an anarchist interpretation of this, and through the understanding of like ethical relationships to war and more particularly self-defense, and I see you also tying this to Fanon and like a Fanonian understanding of violence and decolonization. So maybe you could talk about first just like how jihad is misunderstood. Mm-hmm. And then where you connect this to the decolonial sort of righteous violence that we might need to engage in.
So obviously, as I noted, and we started off the conversation by saying the last chapter is very triggering because, like I said, I saw compañeros die. I saw, teenagers, not even, that were murdered in Tahrir. We shipped bodies out of the Nile after the 18 days, the so-called utopian 18 days. We'll look at Oaxaca. They engaged in a massive uprising in 2006 for 6 months. Maybe that's something we should learn from as people that are engaged insofar as revolutions. In Oaxaca, they took over the television stations, the radio stations, and so on and so forth. It's far more radical than Egypt or any context of the Arab Spring had ever occurred. But red and black power, jihad. Jihad literally means to struggle. There are many forms of jihad. Not all jihad are forms of qital. And qital, the word for qital, the word for battle in Islam or the Quran is actually qital, means to go to war, right? To hold a weapon, to go. In the case of self-defense. So jihad generally means to engage. I could be engaging in jihad when I'm talking with you, when I'm doing this interview, because it's a struggle. It's a struggle to communicate. It's a struggle to deal with exhaustion, flashbacks, trauma, certain assumptions insofar as the words you're using, the words I'm using mean the same things, and trying to respond to the questions. That's a form of jihad. The mother that struggles to feed her children, the single mother, is engaging in a kind of jihad. There's the jihad al-nafs, the jihad al-akbar, the greater jihad, which is to fight against one's fascisms, one's privileges. The smaller jihad, when it is used in the context of jihad, in the context, of qital, it means in that point that, you're engaged in the smaller jihad. But there's jihad of the heart and jihad of the mind. One engages in jihad when one is writing a book, when one is giving a talk. If one was to translate holy war into Arabic, it would be al-harb al-muqaddasa. No such concept exists within Islam. You always hear jihad is synonymous with holy war. The two words are completely different because al-harb al-muqaddasa doesn't even exist within the Arabic lexicon. Jihad does. But the words to actually do battle is qital. Of course, I talk about the etymology of qital itself. It's a concept because it didn't just exist within Islam. Muslims, like I noted, had to suffer years prior to them being allowed the right to self-defend themselves. But even then, there are rules to engaging on qital. And those rules within at least the Muslim manifesto, if you will, how one transposes that manifesto now in the contemporary is a subject that I would be certainly interested, and I sort of gesture that I'd be interested to write about it at a certain point, but it's a complicated situation. Too, when we're talking about weapons of war, drones, submerged submarines, nuclear weapons, tactical and ballistic missiles, and so on and so forth. But the rules of jihad include, obviously, no desecration of, land or territory. If a tree does not serve a strategic purpose insofar as the self-defense, it shall not be removed and displaced. It shall be honored, again, as an extension of creation. You shall not, destroy people's properties. You should not destroy the place that you are entering. Not only that, women, children, let alone the elderly, because it's mostly men that usually participate in war. And hence we need to talk about the trauma, the patriarchy that will be reproduced when these men ostensibly come to war, the accountability, the healing that's necessary, all that becomes a part of the transformative justice and not just restorative justice mechanism that we're looking at if we are to accept that as war being a tactic, the right to self-defense being a tactic. Because you know what? I'm really exhausted by the George Floyds, the Michael Browns, the Sandra Blands, the endless litany of Khalid Saeed, BIPOC that are perishing every single day because that hasn't ended. There's a George Floyd, there's a Sandra Bland every single day. It hasn't ended. Do Black Lives not matter anymore? And if Black Lives Matter over here, does that not mean that I should pay attention to Africa, the size of the US, Canada, let alone East and West Europe and China and Japan? That's how big Africa is. And be dealing with entities like AFRICOM, they're an extension of US imperialism. Well, if Black Lives matter, then they should matter everywhere. And that it's not a matter of just removing sort of a bunch of the names of Confederate bases. It is eliminating the military-industrial complex that conscripts BIPOC people to go and fight other BIPOC people under some military interventionist, human rights, civilizational, developmental democracy flag. Sorry, even the fetishized anti-Black, sexist, misogynist Gandhi was the one that says if there's violence in our hearts, then it's better to be violent than to don the cloak of nonviolence to cover for our impotence. Martin Luther King, and prior to the March on Washington and the Poor People's Campaign, became extremely vocal and disillusioned with nonviolence, extremely vocal with regards to Vietnam and the war on Vietnam, imperialism, many reasons why Malcolm, and there isn't a statue of Malcolm standing, as there is for MLK. The Black Panthers were dignified in their ability and will and conviction to create alternatives, but be willing to defend those alternatives. And yet you had the targeted assassinations and so on and so forth. Look, there is no such thing as violence. Is the racism, the sexism, the queerphobia that folks are exposed to the classism, the ableism, is that not violence? So what does violence exactly mean? Again, I go back to this double speak Orwellian world that we mean, this world of axis of evil, of war against terror, of simulated drowning, of preventive war. What do you mean preventive war? You're launching a war in order to prevent somebody else from ostensibly engaging in a war. You refer to people as collateral damage that are killed when they are civilians because of, and your CIA kidnappings are extraordinary renditions. This is the, if you will, the facade, but also the euphemisms, the, if you will, the English language and the violence that it also affords is maintained. We need to think about the words that we use. We need to think about the meanings and the way that they're deployed when the CIA is training nonviolent activists to be nonviolent. In what world, whether it's Occupy or otherwise, in what world would I accept training, a nonviolent training, and abide by the rules of getting out a permit in order to go and engage in a protest? In what world does that make sense? In what world does a women's march occur in which you're surrounded by trigger-happy cops, anti-blackness right there, let alone on stolen land, and that's supposed to be okay? So there's a lot to be said insofar as Malcolm said, when you stick the knife down or in my back 9 inches and you pull it out 6, sorry, that knife is still in there. And even if you take it out, the wound, the gaping wound, the elegy of complaint, the wail of that complaint is still there. This is the difference between the nuance of worlds when Obama shames black absentee fathers. And there's even a question as to why they perhaps may be absentee fathers and doesn't understand that their cry is actually a wail. He's like, get over yourselves. No, this is a wail of complaint of hundreds of years of oppression, of undue justice, of prison to school pipelines, of pharmaceutical industrial complexes, of agro-industrial complexes, of stand your ground laws, of all sorts of stuff, of being shamed by everybody from Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders that their black kids and youth are being called super predators. So violence is a necessary tactic, and I'm not going to have our colonizer or my oppressor tell me or my kin what are the means and the tools that are necessary. As far as I'm concerned, we reserve all the means that are necessary so far as the rules that our traditions, the rules of war that our traditions afforded us. We're not ones that would engage in wanton violence. It's not our drones that are out destroying entire families, neighborhoods, communities, people in Afghanistan and in Iraq, without these kinds of extrajudicial killings that go against any notion of habeas corpus as defined by Euro-America. So the violence is a necessary tactic. It is one that we need to maintain. We are building something. The fantasy that we would just be allowed to build, even the Zapatistas were not allowed to do that. And one can go back to 1994 and the atrocities that happened in San Juan Cupala and in other places in which indigenous kids' families were murdered. Thank God the indigenous Zapatista movement had the right to defense, let alone the Naxalites, let alone that is a right defined by us and not something for the oppressor to define for us. Again, I understand the cringiness, the shiver, the fear even, but we already live in violence. We already are born and marred, felt the weight of it and the weight of that violence, like I said, before I even came to know my place in the world or the struggles that I'm complicit in or that I'm a part of. So no, we're going to reserve our right to violence and but that is going to be a tactic. It's not our strategy because unlike the Euro-American West, we're not like them. So I think that becomes an important arsenal and one that we need to take our pride in building what we're building. Otherwise, again, we're fooling ourselves. We're fooling ourselves insofar as the machinery that exists in the arms that has a monopoly over the meaning of violence. Every state has a monopoly over the meaning of violence precisely for that reason. It takes violence to produce law. It takes violence to conserve law. It takes violence to exercise law. That's a basic Gambian formula that relates to all nation states. So, sorry, violence is a part of the very structure that we live in. And the question is, how can we delineate that violence in that confrontation? Now, I will not go engage in that confrontation without building something that is worthy of protecting in the first place, because that would be stupid. In Islam, the reason that only a few, as the Quran said, a few of you should go to war. Why? Because if all of you go to war, then what have you built? And what is the purpose and the reason behind that which you built? For your children, for future generations. Our children, as Muhammad Abu Jamal that says, that come from immortality and are the arrows towards infinity. What kind of world are we now leaving to them when it's already too late? When it's already too late, because our children, and how can we honor those of ours that have been martyred? It is something that ought to be keeping us wakeless at night every single day. We sit down and we bury our dead, and the process of mourning is very much ongoing, and the healing will never happen, not at an individual or even collective level, unless we take a firm stance and begin to do what is necessary as opposed to this endless postponement of judgment. The problem with revolutions is that they demand something of us today. And most are unwilling to make the sacrifices that are necessary today for a better tomorrow. And until that is needed, until academics are willing to think of themselves as workers, no different than janitors that are doing their jobs, not as these professional ivory tower bureaucrats, as much as they're incredible knowledge keepers, but we are workers. We are workers. Why aren't we going out? Why aren't we divesting from academies? Why aren't we, with our whatever salaries that we make? I certainly don't make six figures, not even remotely close, but divesting, building alternative schools. Begin, especially after you get tenure and you've published so many books, we need to divest. We need to build on the land. Particularly white professors, to be quite blunt, right? We need to make room for alternative folks to come in, to do their education, funnel them out, to build on the land, create these abolitionist land-back projects alongside our kin. There is no other way, and then to be prepared to defend them. So, most people that speak of nonviolence really have never faced, water cannons or live ammunition. They think of it as some sort of excursionist fantasy that they're engaged in. Sorry, try carrying the body of a 14-year-old to a field hospital in Tahrir, pulling their parents' number out of their pocket and calling their parents and trying to console. And the hospital in which that 14-year-old is being kept, you wouldn't even, it's not a matter of even hospital beds. There isn't even space. You're leaving them where you wouldn't even, in rooms where that are filthy rooms you wouldn't even leave your dog. And that kid told their parents that they're going to the movies. What honor and what glory is there in that, in witnessing that? How do we honor that life? That kid never went to the movies, never really had a significant other or partner or perhaps experienced love. What reason did they die for? So that we can just continue on living? I refuse to believe that. So by any means necessary, because it should be, and we should all feel that it's over, it's done. And the fact that we have this degree of patience, I think speaks more to our character, but also how we're not abiding by our traditions, because Islam and God and the Quran extol, yes, patience when there's persecution, but it also asks you to fight back, because how long is one to withstand persecution? Till an entire nation is decimated, till our entire tradition or people are decimated? Forget that. So that would be my response insofar as violence. And there's a lot that can be talked about insofar as that. But let's go back. Let's go back to Stokey, Carmichael. Let's go back. There is no evading the violence. It is already here. So yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing all of that, including your personal sort of experiences of that too. And talking with you is very inspiring, and I think this book contains so much more than we could even, we could encapsulate in a conversation. So I really appreciate you taking the time. Is there anything else that you want to say or share?
Thank you. I'm very grateful for your labor, for your investment in the work, for this opportunity to speak to it, for the audience ostensibly that will be listening. I bid you all adieu. I pray you're well, and I pray to see you on the streets. And mobilizing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think we need to take this time to reflect upon the history of humans moving rocks. This past week's events were a milestone in humans moving rocks. NASA the National Acronym Spewing Administration undertook what it has termed an experimental effort at planetary defense, launching DART, Dumb Americans Running Tests. The mission of DART was to run headlong at 14,000 miles an hour into an asteroid orbiting another planet in our solar system. NASA officials spoke about the importance of this mission for the security of Earth, since there's an event about every 1,000 years where an asteroid will hit our planet and fuck everything up. NASA officials didn't use the specific phrase, fuck everything up, at least not in the official briefings, but I think there's ample evidence of asteroids fucking everything up. Just ask the dinosaurs. No, not the baby boomers, the real dinosaurs. Anyway, this past week, NASA's unmanned DART succeeded in crashing into an asteroid and altering its course. This led to the conclusion that if an asteroid hurtles toward Earth, we now have the technology to intercept the asteroid and save ourselves from an extinction event. Yay us. Of course, that's an incredibly flawed conclusion, since the asteroid that DART hit wasn't coming directly at us and was in a predictable orbit to be intercepted, and we had all kinds of time to prepare for this event. To give an analogy, trying to intercept an asteroid heading to Earth on a collision course would be kind of like trying to locate a NASCAR driver speeding down any one of 1,000 interstate highways on any day of the year and guiding your vehicle into a head-on collision. What NASA actually accomplished is more like targeting a pedestrian on a known street at noon and running her over with a minivan. Big difference. So, I have some thoughts about this. First, I was extremely disappointed that this was an unmanned mission, because I saw the movie in the late 90s with Liv Tyler, and I thought this was the perfect opportunity for NASA to get rid of Bruce Willis and Ben Affleck, particularly since Affleck is no longer portraying Batman. And that led me to pondering how all these billionaires want to go to space. This would be the perfect mission for them. Just send Richard Branson, Jeff Bezos, and Elon Musk out there to give that asteroid a good push. I just thought of the looks on their faces. I think it's pretty clear that this mission is designed to make us feel smarter and safer than we really should. I mean, all that happened here is that humans moved a rock. Yeah, it was a big rock, and it was far away, and NASA used cool technology to move it, but it was still just humans moving a rock. It's not that big a deal. I've moved rocks. I've done it for free. In fact, just to put this into context, humans have a long history of moving rocks. We have a whole era of human existence named after our manipulation of rocks, albeit under the synonym for rocks. It's called the Stone Age. Yeah, our use of rocks was so ubiquitous, and Epic is named for it. And that means NASA accomplished the same amazing feat as our hairy, smelly ancestors who fornicated in the mud and crushed the skulls of their prospective lunch with primitive weapons. Meanwhile, if you look down from the heavens where NASA spent $1 gazillion to move a rock that wasn't bothering anybody, you'll see the convergences of a great many extinction-level events that confront us. Real extinction-level events that NASA can't move with a space probe. Just this week, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Florida were trashed by hurricanes, given far more power by the warm ocean waters that are a foot higher, all consequences of global warming. The Amazon is burning. The oceans are dying. In the war in Ukraine, a war that can be arguably linked, at least in part, to energy hegemony and the drive to political consolidation to achieve that, there's talk of using tactical nukes. Nukes! Who would be so crazy as to deploy nuclear weapons? Except the United States. And Coolio died. NASA doesn't have an answer for any of this shit. They're working to save us from an event that may or may not occur in the next 1,000 years, and we might not even make it through the World Cup in December. If there's intelligent life out there in the universe, they may someday investigate our extinction, a perfectly preventable self-inflicted fatality. And they may conclude by saying, this is the same species who shoved that fucking rock at us when we weren't even bothering them. These assholes deserve what they did to themselves. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Multimax in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain, number A243205, OSP Youngstown, 878 Coatesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at seanswain.org. This is The Final Straw. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.